Boston stretched out in shades of gray and caramel, wrapped in winds whispering through the nearly bare branches of ancient sycamore trees. Winter was approaching with measured steps, and the damp sidewalks reflected the streetlights like fragments of past memories. Amid the red brick buildings and Victorian facades that told silent stories stood the Massachusetts General Hospital, an imposing structure blending the weight of tradition with the impersonal efficiency of the present. Its cold, austere walls housed endless corridors where time seemed to dilate. Inside, the air carried the scent of antiseptic, and the muffled sound of hurried footsteps, mixed with the steady beeping of heart monitors and the soft hum of metal wheels cutting through the silence with an almost rehearsed smoothness. It was a place where lives crossed unknowingly, where science sustained hope, and where control tried to overpower the chaos of the human condition. The professionals moved like perfectly adjusted pieces of a precise mechanism, and every room seemed to hold its own invisible narrative. At the top of the hospital, panoramic windows offered views of the Charles River, whose slow waters meandered between fog-covered banks. The scene provided a harsh contrast, clinical rigor inside and serene beauty outside. On cloudy days, the reflections of docked boats floated like shadows, and on clear days, white sails cut across the horizon softly, like unfinished musical scores. It was in this same silent rhythm that the city pulsed, not loudly, but firmly. Even the most modern buildings seemed to respect the past, and Boston, with its intellectual and artistic soul, remained rooted on the banks of time. Not far from there, nestled between historic streets and hills covered in golden leaves, a small cafe called Maple and Mist breathed tranquility. With arched windows and a discreet sign, the place attracted a constant, quiet crowd: university students, doctors on breaks, and artists seeking refuge. The aroma of cinnamon mixed with fresh coffee created a cozy atmosphere where the outside world seemed to slow down. Steaming cups rested on dark wooden tables, and an old piano leaning against the wall exuded charm and nostalgia, even when silent. It was there that memories formed effortlessly, where discreet presences repeated without being noticed, and where the city showed its most intimate face. Parallel to the constant motion of hospitals and cafes, the Beacon Hill Garden stood as a living reliquary of the city. It was a hidden garden, tucked between narrow alleys, accessible only to those who knew it well. In the fall, its trees formed a golden dome, filtering the light delicately and covering the ground with a carpet of dry leaves that crunched underfoot. Wrought iron benches rested beneath ivy-covered pergolas, and the occasional sound of a violin in the distance floated through the air as if it were part of the landscape itself. Even during the cold months, when the branches were stripped bare, the place maintained an aura of contemplation, as if it welcomed ancient silences and unspoken confidences. On the other side of the neighborhood, the Boston Public Library stood as a sanctuary of knowledge and peace. Its marble columns bore the weight of history and scholarship, and its halls were filled with a dense, respectful, almost liturgical silence. Young and old mingled among the shelves, their eyes scanning titles with reverence. On the second floor, tall windows allowed natural light to pour in, casting long shadows on the light wooden floors. It was common to find solitary figures hunched over old books, copying notes into notebooks or simply leafing through the pages slowly, as if each word carried a specific weight in time. Within these walls, the city revealed its most sensitive vein, its willingness to remember, to record, to preserve. Connecting all these spaces, a network of winding streets and historic buildings maintained the city's coherence, linking the clinical rigor of the hospital to the delicacy of the cafe, the contemplation of the garden to the wisdom of the library. Ethan and Ava's Boston wasn't made of grand events or hurried crowds, but of small moments, subtle encounters, and dense atmospheres that slowly shaped the destinies of those who lived there. And it was within this setting, between the silence of music and the rhythm of heartbeats, that a story began, marked by the invisible presence of a feeling in the making, discreet but impossible to ignore. As if the very fabric of the city vibrated to the rhythm of something about to happen, something beyond control, but already beginning to reveal itself within the walls of places where everything, on the surface, seemed to remain the same. In the almost ritualistic rhythm of a city that at times welcomed introspection and at others demanded excellence, Dr. Ethan Caldwell walked as an inseparable part of this dense, restrained urban fabric. Inside the Massachusetts General Hospital, his name circulated with respect through the corridors and operating rooms. He was recognized not only for his steady hands and precise decisions, but also for the elegance with which he handled silences, those moments when life seemed to hang in the balance, and he, eyes fixed on the monitor, determined the outcome with a restrained but definitive gesture. There was no rush in his movements, no hesitation in his conduct. At 34, he had become what many aspired to be, a respected, reliable specialist whose presence brought calm and authority. And yet, behind the perfectly aligned lab coat and the always polished shoes, something remained locked away, inaccessible. Ethan grew up in Newton, a residential town near Boston, in a home where mealtimes coincided with his father's hospital rounds, his father, also a cardiologist, and where studies were treated with the same rigor as an operating room. His mother, a neurologist renowned for academic articles published in prestigious universities, maintained a schedule of excellence as strict as her publications demanded. Ethan's childhood wasn't marked by spontaneous play, but by reading commitments, medical simulations, and a constant reminder of the weight carried in his last name. He grew up surrounded by walls lined with diplomas and scientific trophies, and learned, from an early age, that feelings had to fit into controlled spaces, never interfering with rational decisions. By the time he was 16, he already mastered complex medical terminology and was doing observational internships at the same hospital, where he would later hold a prestigious position. The path seemed inevitable, mapped out long before any conscious choice was made. His time at the university solidified this profile, a blend of talent, control, and discretion. Between anatomy textbooks and long hours in the medical library, Ethan kept his distance from parties, social groups, or anything that didn't align with his purpose. He graduated with honors, immersed in academic achievements that, to many, represented absolute success. But deep down, there was an absence growing like a faint shadow, never completely ignored, but always postponed. During the long night shifts, that shadow showed itself in the silence of the break rooms, in the echo of empty hallways, and especially in the difficulty he had seeing patients as anything more than bodies to be saved. Faces passed him by like brief clinical variations. Every personal story became nothing more than a fragment in technical charts. He was effective, admired, but kept his soul armored, as if any emotional crack would jeopardize his precision. Even outside the hospital environment, his life reflected the same pattern. He lived in a modern apartment in the Back Bay area, decorated with functional sobriety. The shelves displayed medical volumes mixed with a few novels, and the only music playing came from carefully curated ambient playlists. He didn't cultivate intimate friendships or maintain ties beyond professional contacts. His routine started early with black coffee, report reading, and clinical reviews. On Sundays, he took solitary walks through Beacon Hill Garden, observing the changing seasons with the same clinical gaze he applied to diagnostic exams. There, among dry leaves or fresh sprouts, he noticed that the world turned with a softness that escaped his spreadsheets and schedules. But he didn't allow himself to dwell on those reflections for long. He quickly resumed his pace, like someone fleeing the risk of recognizing something they couldn't control. His relationship with patients followed that same pattern of polished distance. Ethan maintained impeccable professionalism, explained diagnoses clearly, and conveyed security with every word. But he avoided any affectionate touch, listening beyond medical necessity, or gestures that might show emotional involvement. To his colleagues, this was part of his efficiency. To him, it was a way of preserving the structure that upheld his identity. He had seen, even during his residency, doctors collapse under the weight of poorly managed emotional bonds, and swore that would never happen to him. It was better to stay in control, even if that meant a form of isolation that became increasingly subtle and deeply rooted. However, over the years, that absolute control began to show small cracks. Not in clinical failures, but in brief moments that escaped his vigilance. When he lingered longer than necessary at the bedside of an elderly patient, when he caught himself staring at a photograph left on someone's nightstand, or when he heard from afar the sound of a piano coming from the pediatric wing and allowed himself to stop for a few seconds. These subtle interruptions started forming a mosaic, imperceptible to others, but present in his daily life. And even without admitting it, he recognized that something inside him longed for more than surgical precision and closed reports. It was as if, for the first time, the heartbeat he knew so well how to control began to move outside the established rhythm. Even so, he didn't change his conduct. He remained firm, centered, focused, until the day an unexpected patient occupied bed 217, and without uttering a single word, forever altered the course of his own vital frequency. While Massachusetts General Hospital continued its course between diagnoses and silent routines, in another part of the city, far from hallways lined with precision, life unfolded at a different pace, guided by sounds and sensibilities that didn't fit into medical exams. Ava Thompson lived within that parallel rhythm. At 29 years old, she found in the sound of piano keys a safe space where pain, memory, and hope could coexist. She lived in a small apartment in South Boston, decorated with sentimental simplicity, light curtains, stacked sheet music, old photographs, and in the center of the room, the piano she inherited from her parents. It was there, among walls marked by books and children's drawings, that Ava transformed loss into music. Ever since her parents died in a car accident on the way to a concert where she was set to perform as a teenager, Ava discovered that pain didn't have to be silent. It could sound in D minor or echo in slow tempos, yet still find a way out. Over the years, this understanding shaped the way she lived her life. With a degree in classical music and a specialization in music education, she dedicated her days to teaching children in a community school, despite scarce resources and a limited infrastructure. Every morning, she crossed neighborhoods wearing the same worn coat and carrying a bag filled with colored pencils, folded sheet music, and hidden candies to hand out to her young students. The school didn't have a real piano, but that never stopped her from teaching rhythm, melody, and emotion. Ava believed that music only needed a willing heart, and hers still beat for every child who saw in that learning a chance to dream. Even though she had declined offers from better-funded private schools, she never regretted it. Her dream was different. She wanted to create a free music education center where no child had to pay to play, to feel, and to express themselves. That's why she saved every extra penny, sold sweets at cultural fairs, and performed modest recitals in churches and cafes. Music for her was more than a profession. It was healing. It was shelter. It was a mission. On the days when she wasn't teaching, Ava frequented the Boston Public Library, where she studied books on child psychology and wrote drafts for the projects she hoped to present to potential sponsors. She spent hours there, surrounded by whispers and yellowed pages, scribbling ideas and dreaming of rooms filled with colorful instruments, empathetic teachers, and improvised stages. Despite the loneliness she sometimes felt, especially at night when the silence in her apartment felt heavier, Ava didn't let it bring her down. She had learned to live with the absence of her parents as if it were a kind of second language, something only she understood but never needed to explain to anyone. And even though she had no family nearby, she cultivated bonds with coworkers, elderly neighbors, and some children whose families trusted her like an older sister. She carried this role with lightness and care, never allowing her own sadness to take over. She knew that even when words couldn't say everything, music could still fill the empty spaces. One Friday night, Ava prepared for another charity recital organized at a neighborhood cultural center. She had rehearsed for weeks for that event, with all proceeds going toward the purchase of new instruments for her students. She wore a simple but elegant dress, tied her hair with a blue ribbon, a gift from one of her students, and walked to the venue feeling the light chill that signaled winter was near. When she stepped onto the stage and sat at the piano, a small but warm audience welcomed her with sincere applause. The first piece flowed effortlessly. Her fingers glided across the keys with the precision of someone who knew every nuance of the melody. But in the second movement, something within her faltered. A sharp pain shot through her neck, and her vision began to blur. She tried to continue, but the notes slipped out of rhythm. Within seconds, Ava lost control of her arms, and her body collapsed beside the instrument. The audience stood in shock. Organizers rushed to assist her, and the ambulance arrived minutes later. Upon arriving at the hospital, the diagnosis was quick and undeniable: a brain aneurysm. The condition required immediate intervention. Ava was urgently transferred to Massachusetts General Hospital, where the neurology team received her in critical condition. Intubated and unconscious, she was taken to the intensive care unit. bed 217, the same bed Ethan had observed days earlier while reviewing medical charts, never imagining what would soon occupy that space. The coma was deep and unstable. Scans showed brain activity, but no conscious response. The medical team rotated in shifts to care for her, while Ava's belongings were delivered in a plastic box: a phone with a cracked screen, a planner filled with children's notes taped between the pages, and an unfinished handwritten sheet of music titled, "For When You Wake Up." There were no close relatives to authorize medical decisions, only old records of a legal guardian who had already passed away. It was within this silent and clinical context that Ava's and Ethan's paths crossed, not through words or planned encounters, but through an involuntary presence that, as the days passed, began to subtly influence the doctor's methodical routine. He didn't know her, but he felt that this patient represented something that escaped the usual parameters. There was something about the way she remained still yet alive, as if the notes she hadn't finished playing still vibrated around her, insisting on existing, and without realizing it, Ethan began changing small behaviors, lingering longer when reviewing Ava's reports, going over her scans with a care that went beyond duty, and, on some mornings, glancing toward bed 217 as he passed through the ICU, as if searching for invisible signs of a response. Ava's presence in the hospital, although initially reduced to tests, reports, and silent monitoring, soon began to alter how the hallways seemed to breathe. It was as if something about her, perhaps her story, perhaps the impression left by the forgotten sheet music, brought to the surface deeper layers that had until then remained dormant within Ethan. Her arrival in the intensive care unit happened during an early morning of biting cold when the city was hushed under the dense veil of the coastal breeze. Ethan was on call that shift, like so many other nights when time seemed to slip away between scalpels and protocols, when he was summoned to attend to a young patient suffering from an advanced brain aneurysm. The urgency of the case mobilized the team with automatic speed, but something caught Ethan's attention the moment her name appeared on the chart. Ava Thompson was admitted unconscious, with unstable neurological signs and elevated intracranial pressure. The initial scans revealed the extent of the bleeding, and the data required an immediate decision. The protocol called for inducing a coma to preserve vital functions and prevent further damage. Ethan took the lead on the procedure without hesitation, knowing full well that, technically, other colleagues could have done it. Still, something about Ava's fragile appearance made him stay. Her eyelids trembled slightly during the first minutes of sedation. Her face, although pale, held a strange serenity, as if there were a silent battle between her body and some inner part that insisted on resisting. Ethan oversaw every step with meticulous focus, refusing to let the automatism that usually guided his movements take over the scene. He administered the medication with precision, instructed the residents firmly, and carried out the procedure with a rigor that allowed no room for error. When the procedure was over, and the surroundings settled back into calm, with the monitors stabilizing the numbers on the screens, Ethan remained by her bedside for a few more moments, watching Ava in silence. She was unconscious, yet there was a steady pulse on her face, as if the music that defined her still vibrated within her, even without sound. Her heartbeat responded well, the brain reacted as expected to the induced coma, and the immediate risk was contained. However, the team knew the road ahead would be long, uncertain, and in many ways, lonely. The absence of family members made it difficult to make delicate decisions, and Ethan had to consult the hospital's legal department to ensure her treatment continued within ethical and legal parameters. He signed forms, updated reports, and finally added a handwritten note to her chart. Something he rarely did. He recommended that Ava's condition be kept under direct surveillance, with frequent reports and heightened attention to any changes, no matter how small. The following days passed with an apparently unchanged routine, but Ethan began to notice small shifts in his own behavior. He walked past the ICU more often than necessary, even when he wasn't on shift. He would stop in front of the glass that separated the hallway from bed 217 and watch Ava for a few minutes, as if it had become part of a ritual he himself didn't fully understand. Her music he had never actually heard, began to occupy an invisible space in his mind. He imagined what the sounds she created were like, the gestures she made when she played, the silence between one note and the next. He couldn't explain it, but her presence stirred something rare within him, the feeling of being faced with something he couldn't yet control, And for a man like Ethan, used to mastering variables, numbers, and physiological rhythms, that feeling imposed itself as a new and unsettling force. While Ava remained in a coma, connected to monitors and sustained by precise medications, Ethan began searching for details that went beyond the boundaries of medicine. He read her chart with heightened attention, noticing pieces of her life that would normally be reduced to mere data: her occupation as a teacher, her history of loss, the absence of close family, the traces of a life lived with intensity and affection. He picked up the sheet music found among her belongings, and, even without knowing much about music, tried to decipher the emotion hidden within the strokes of her handwriting. It was an unfinished piece, with a few crossed-out measures, as if Ava had been interrupted while still constructing something essential. It touched him in an unexpected way. He folded the paper and tucked it into his lab coat pocket, and during breaks between surgeries, he would take it out just to feel that something inside it still breathed. The staff around him began to notice the change. Nurses commented in hushed tones that Dr. Caldwell seemed more present, though quieter than usual. Residents watched as he spent more time in the ICU, reviewing data that others had already double-checked. But no one questioned it. After all, his results remained impeccable, and Ethan upheld his flawless posture in the operating rooms. Still, something had shifted within him. His usual rigidity began giving way to subtle hesitations, and the precision of his medical movements was now accompanied by a kind of care that bordered on tenderness. The hands that once cut with precision now rested more gently on the shoulders of colleagues, and his voice, still firm, carried a faint warmth that had previously been smothered by the demand for perfection. Time moved slowly in the intensive care unit. The seasons shifted, and the view from the patient room windows reflected the transition from autumn to winter. The red leaves of Beacon Hill began falling more frequently, forming dense carpets on the sidewalks of Boston. Outside, cafes filled the air with the smell of cinnamon and warm apple, while inside the hospital, the days piled up in charts, reports, and silences. Ava remained unconscious, but her presence did not go unnoticed. Nurses adjusted her blankets with greater delicacy. Some staff members left anonymous notes with messages of hope on her bedside table, and a young nursing technician, upon learning she was a music teacher, started discreetly playing pieces of Chopin and Debussy on her phone, placing it on Ava's desk. Ethan only learned about this gesture days later, when he noticed that certain vital signs in Ava shifted slightly during the music. There was nothing conclusive, nothing strictly scientific, but the pattern caught his attention. From that moment on, he began documenting the relationship between the sounds and her physiological responses, starting an informal report that he shared with no one. It was as if he were searching, in those tiny reactions, for some form of contact, something that transcended the coma and reached Ava's sleeping consciousness. This was no longer just about medicine. It was moving him in a direction far beyond anything he had ever known. And even though he wouldn't admit it to himself, Ava Thompson had already become more than a critically ill patient. She had become a presence that was quietly rearranging the inner spaces of a man who, for a long time, believed he was immune to anything he couldn't measure. Even after weeks, Ava's presence continued occupying a quiet, yet constant space in the background of Ethan's thoughts. The bed where she lay unconscious seemed to generate its own atmosphere, an invisible field where time unfolded under a different logic. She was no longer simply a patient under intensive surveillance. Something in the way her body rested, in the rhythm of her neurological responses, in the serenity she emitted even surrounded by tubes and monitors, began producing a subtle shift in Ethan, imperceptible to others, but profoundly active within him. This transformation didn't happen abruptly, nor did it reveal itself immediately. It arrived the way all deep things do, from the edges, in seemingly trivial details, in gestures that didn't appear significant until they became decisive. It was during a particularly quiet morning that Ethan, while reviewing the vital signs on the monitor next to her bed, noticed something tucked under Ava's pillow. The nursing staff, while organizing her personal belongings days earlier, had likely left a few everyday items nearby, as a way of preserving a minimal sense of familiarity around her. Among them was a small pair of earbuds, carefully wrapped, with the cord already slightly worn at the ends. As he gently pulled it out, Ethan realized it was connected to a simple music player, an old, portable model with a scratched surface but still functional. When he pressed the side button, the screen lit up briefly, and revealed the last song paused, a piece by Rachmaninoff. That wasn't random. The choice said a lot, and he knew it without needing to put it into words. Discovering those earbuds shouldn't have had any effect. In a hospital's routine, personal items are just that, extensions of whoever lived outside the white walls. But in that moment, the little device became a silent bridge between Ethan and Ava. It was as if, for the first time, he was touching something that truly belonged to her. The paused music held more than melody. It held intention, taste, history. This wasn't just any playlist. The lineup he found as he browsed the device revealed a sensitive and refined curation. Works by Clara Schumann, lesser-known pieces by Satie, live performances of solo piano sonatas that demanded more emotion than technique. This was no casual selection. It was an extension of her soul, condensed into sound. Ethan began returning to that device during breaks between shifts, when the ICU grew quiet and the hallway was empty. He would hold the earbuds in his hands with almost reverent care, like someone handling something too fragile to be disturbed. One afternoon, he pressed play and allowed the notes of a Chopin prelude to fill the silence of the staff lounge. He hadn't listened to classical music since childhood, when his father enforced strict rules about which composers deserved reverence and which were merely exercises in ear training. But in that moment, the notes hit him differently. They no longer carried the weight of obligation or discipline. They were soft, alive, intimate. And for the first time in years, Ethan closed his eyes for a few minutes and simply listened. Listening had become a secret habit. Between surgeries, reports, and technical rounds, Ethan found small gaps in his schedule to return to Ava's playlist. It felt like visiting a place he no longer knew how to belong to, but that for some reason still welcomed him. Her compositions, because that's how he now thought of them, began shaping his state of mind. He started operating with less rigidity, correcting resonance with less sharpness, and finding pauses within himself that he hadn't recognized in a long time. The hospital remained demanding, the protocols as strict as ever, but the way he existed within that environment was beginning to change. All of this because of a worn-out pair of headphones, hidden beneath a white pillow, beside an unconscious woman who had never exchanged a single word with him. During an extended shift one afternoon, as the city lights began invading the sky with bluish tones, Ethan realized his steps had automatically led him to Ava's room. There was no clinical urgency at that moment. Her condition remained stable. The sedation continued as planned, but he felt he needed to be there. He observed her face closely. The serene expression was still intact, her lips slightly parted by the rhythmic breathing, and her hair gently tied back by a nurse who had learned her personal preferences by reading old notes in her journal. On the table beside her, the music player rested like a reliquary. Ethan sat for a few moments in the chair against the wall. He allowed himself to listen one more time, and when the piece started to play, something different happened. The heart monitor emitted a slight fluctuation. It wasn't an alarming spike, nor anything dangerous, but it was enough to capture his attention. In the following days, when he repeated the experiment, he noticed that certain specific pieces of music generated more significant physiological responses. Ava's pupils would dilate slightly, her heart rate would shift by a few beats, and her breathing followed a slightly deeper rhythm. None of this was conclusive from a technical standpoint. Any other doctor would have logged it as normal fluctuations in a comatose body, but Ethan knew. He knew there was an invisible thread connecting those sounds to her consciousness, and that's when he understood. Music wasn't just a memory or a source of comfort for Ava. It was her identity, her language, and somehow, she was still expressing herself through it, even in silence. That realization completely changed the connection Ethan had with her case. From then on, he began studying her repertoire, searching for sheet music, reading notes Ava had scribbled in journals stored among her personal belongings. He discovered that she transcribed some compositions by ear, that she taught children at a community center using her own methods, and that she dreamed of turning music into a form of social refuge. None of this appeared in any exam, CT scan, or clinical chart, but it was there, available to anyone willing to look beyond the illness. Ethan began to look, and in doing so, he allowed something within himself, stifled for decades, to finally begin awakening. Ethan's involvement with Ava's world deepened progressively, almost imperceptibly. Music, once just background noise in the hospital halls, now inhabited his days with constancy. But it was only when Madison appeared, her eyes heavy with anxiety and a folder of documents shaking in her hands, that Ethan began to understand more clearly the contours of the woman he had until then known only through silence. Madison was a longtime friend of Ava's, and after being approved as her emergency contact, she came to the hospital to understand what had truly happened. She brought with her small keepsakes, copies of handwritten sheet music, saved notes, and photos taken in simple moments, alongside children in a modest school, standing in front of the old keyboard she kept in the tiny apartment where she had lived alone since her parents' passing. Ethan received the materials with a still composed expression, but his eyes discreetly scanned every single detail. Madison's words were delivered with controlled emotion. She shared how Ava dedicated her days to teaching music to children in the outskirts of Boston. At an improvised community center she had helped build with her own resources and donations from friends. She explained how, despite financial difficulties, Ava consistently refused offers to work in more elitist environments because she believed music didn't belong to a privileged few. It belonged to everyone. Madison also revealed that Ava spent her weekends giving small, free recitals where she performed pieces by Debussy, Chopin, Satie, Clara Schumann, and other composers who, according to Ava, could say the things words never could. She handed Ethan a personal notebook filled with Ava's scattered thoughts, scribbled alongside musical excerpts, often accompanied by symbols and patterns no one seemed to understand, but that clearly held meaning for her. Ethan listened with growing focus, absorbing every word as if it were composing a living portrait of someone who was no longer just a patient. From that meeting forward, something realigned within him. Not only because of what he learned, but also because of how that information connected with what he had already been observing. Ava's physiological reactions to sound stimuli now seemed far less random. It was as if the music functioned as a bridge between two worlds, the conscious and the unconscious, the external and the internal, the technical and the emotional. Ethan then began exploring the composers Madison had mentioned more deeply. He returned to old recordings of Debussy, allowed himself to feel the gentle impact of Satie's simplicity, dove into the emotional layers of Chopin's ballads, and was surprised by the hidden strength in Clara Schumann's works. He didn't do this out of obligation. It wasn't part of any protocol, but something compelled him. It was as if, by understanding what Ava loved, he was also accessing forgotten parts of himself. The days started to feel different. The time between surgeries and consultations gradually became filled with brief pauses where music seeped in. In his office, the headphones now held a permanent place next to his stethoscope. In his car, the radio was replaced by playlists filled with compositions he once considered too abstract. But now, influenced by Ava, they carried new meaning. Every note seemed charged with intention. And the more he listened, the more he realized how much he had neglected his own sensitivity in the name of efficiency. Medicine demanded control, technique, and focus. But music demanded surrender, listening, and presence. Two ways of touching another person, through very different means, yet equally transformative. Madison's presence also became a regular part of the routine. She returned to the hospital several times a week, bringing items from home, fresh flowers, and books with handwritten dedications. She insisted on keeping Ava's room as warm and welcoming as possible, even without knowing when, or if, her friend would ever wake up. Ethan, who once would have kept a certain distance, quietly began allowing small changes to the environment. He let the music play longer during visits, allowed natural light to filter in through the partially opened window, and even replaced the hospital sheets with softer fabrics chosen by Madison. No one questioned his decisions. The nurses noticed the shift in his behavior, but preferred not to comment. They understood that, with Ethan, every gesture came wrapped in silence. But it was no longer the silence of rigidity. Now, it carried a different weight. Lighter, more intimate. Ava, though still unconscious, seemed to respond. Small changes in her vital signs indicated stimuli that went beyond the physiological. The music, now an almost constant presence, seemed to penetrate her inner barriers with an intensity that defied medical expectations. Ethan recorded everything meticulously, but kept part of his observations to himself. He didn't want to turn that experience into data or a research paper. There was something happening that went beyond objectivity, and for the first time, he accepted that without resistance. This wasn't just about a clinical case anymore. It was about recognizing within himself the ability to be moved by someone, even if that person hadn't yet opened her eyes. Ava's influence also began to reverberate beyond the walls of the hospital. Ethan, who had always avoided social gatherings and maintained an almost monastic life, started quietly attending small musical performances downtown. He would sit in the back rows, listen attentively, and leave in silence. He watched the pianists with focused eyes, no longer as a doctor, but as someone trying to understand a language that had always escaped him. He collected programs, noted down the names of pieces, and compared performances. It was an invisible study, driven not by ambition or professional goals, but by a genuine search. And in every note, he searched for signs of Ava, traces of the woman he still didn't truly know, yet who, effortlessly, had uncovered forgotten parts of his own soul. As the days went by, Ava's invisible presence began to inhabit spaces that once belonged solely to Ethan's clinical routine. The music she loved, once listened to merely out of curiosity, began to accompany his movements naturally. During pauses between surgeries, while waiting for test results, as he walked down the hospital halls, or while filling out charts in silence, his discreet headphones played the melodies that, little by little, became the soundtrack of the transformation growing inside him. The softness of Debussy seemed to cradle the passing of time. Satie's subtle notes brought an internal silence that was hard to reach, and Chopin's melancholic harmonies blended with his focus, as if they were part of the very pulse of the hospital. It wasn't just about listening anymore. Ethan had allowed that music to touch him, and the silent connection forming between him and Ava transcended the boundary between doctor and patient. This intangible bond grew stronger without the need for words. Ethan didn't try to rationalize what he felt, nor did he attempt to label the internal shifts that deepened with each new listen. Ava's presence, though motionless, felt alive and vibrant through the music. It was as if she were speaking to him through the compositions, as if each piece carried fragments of her personality, her fears, her hopes, and the way she saw the world. Ethan, who was so used to mastering protocols and navigating through scientific certainties, now allowed himself to drift into undefined sensations. There was no control there, and yet there was comfort. The familiarity he had with other people's pain, which had often emotionally armored him, was now giving way to a sharper, more open sensitivity. The music flowing through his headphones didn't just fill the silence of the room, it filled a void he hadn't even realized he carried. At certain moments, during his longest shifts, Ethan would catch himself staring at Ava's medical chart, his eyes frozen, listening to the music as if searching for answers that no scan or test could ever provide. He quietly began adjusting the timing of her sedative medication, trying to maintain a more delicate balance between the stability of the induced coma and the moments of auditory stimulation, always within ethical boundaries, but also guided by something that went far beyond the medical manuals. The rest of the team noticed these subtle changes, cautiously, but with respect. They knew Ethan would never risk a life, but they also knew that this patient was awakening something new in him. Some of the more seasoned staff would quietly remark that they had never seen him so present, so attentive to the human details behind the diagnoses. He was no longer just a neurologist operating with precision. He was a man making space to feel, even if he couldn't fully understand what was unfolding inside him. Ava's room, in turn, began to reflect this new atmosphere. The once cold, clinical space now held elements that softened its impersonality. The flowers Madison brought remained fresh, always carefully replaced. The sheet music left beside her bed occupied the space with dignity, as if honoring the memory of someone who had played them with devotion. Small speakers were discreetly installed, and even at low volume, they ensured a constant musical presence. Ethan, from time to time, adjusted the playlist intuitively, selecting calmer pieces for long nights, and more intense ones during periods when Ava's vital signs showed slight fluctuations. Everything was documented, but much more felt than explained, and in that quiet rhythm, the connection between the two solidified into something real, even if one-sided, even if silent, even if absent of any visible reciprocity. At the same time, Ethan began to notice how this bond with Ava was changing the way he looked at his other patients. His listening became more attentive, protocols more flexible, and his touch noticeably gentler. Words he once saved out of habit were now spoken with greater intention. His eyes, always so focused on imaging scans, now also sought out faces more often. This shift was subtle, but irreversible. It wasn't about sudden passion or some romantic impulse. It was a profound discovery of sensitivity, provoked by the silent presence of someone he didn't know in life, but who now filled inner spaces with an inexplicable force. Ethan wasn't thinking about the future, nor considering any sentimental possibilities. He simply continued, day after day, carried by a quiet transformation born in the rhythm of Ava's music and spreading to everything around him. Those closest to him noticed something had changed. Some attributed it to exhaustion, others to the recent loss of his father, a pain Ethan never openly spoke about, but that everyone somehow knew had left its mark. Yet no one dared to confront him. The change didn't seem harmful. On the contrary, Ethan appeared calmer, less rigid. Though his clinical precision remained intact, there was a new kind of presence in every gesture, and all of it seemed connected to that patient in a coma, that young woman who hadn't awakened, but who, paradoxically, seemed more alive inside him than many who walked the hospital halls every day. Ava, even in silence, offered him a kind of invisible companionship, and Ethan, without even realizing it, accepted that presence with a naturalness that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. In the quietest hours of the night, Ethan allowed himself to stay longer by Ava's bedside. He would slip his headphones over his ears, let the music surround him, and simply remain there, observing the peacefulness of her face, the steady rhythm of her induced breathing, the faint twitch of her eyelids, the absolute silence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. It was as if everything that needed to be said was already present in the compositions filling the space between them. Sometimes his eyes would linger on a detail of her face, the curve of her lips, the softness of her skin, the delicate line of her jaw, and in those pauses, something stirred inside him, as though a memory was being formed before it even existed. It wasn't desire, it was presence. It was as if, in that almost sacred stillness, he was being quietly remade from within. Little by little, the emotional distance Ethan had always kept from his patients dissolved, not just with Ava, but with everyone, as if she, through her absence of voice, had taught him how to listen again, to listen with his whole being. And in that silence, he connected with her, not with words, not with touch, not with promises, but with music. And through that, he discovered a language that had always been within reach, but that only now found a way to express itself. The connection didn't need to be understood, it only needed to be felt. And day by day, with no rush, Ethan dove into that invisible territory where Ava, still unconscious, continued to transform everything around her, including him. The bond between Ethan and Ava, built without words and held together only by music, deepened over time. The neurologist, who once walked through the wards with the objectivity of a scientist, now made quiet detours to visit her room, as though that space was the only place where the world seemed to slow down. He began to go beyond the mandatory clinical check-ins. During the longest nights or the quieter late afternoons, Ethan would appear at room 217 without announcement, almost like a secret visitor. He brought with him a tablet wrapped in a dark case, where he had downloaded countless classical music collections. He carefully chose which tracks to play, favoring the lesser-known but delicate melodies, as if trying to surprise Ava, even without knowing if she could hear him. And it was in those moments of choosing that he realized just how deeply he was already involved. He thought about her, tried to imagine what she would like to hear, how she might react to that sequence of notes, whether a particular chord might awaken some memory in her. None of this was part of any protocol, and maybe that's exactly why it felt so genuine. On one of those nighttime visits, he noticed a forgotten envelope sitting on the bedside table, written in the childish handwriting of one of Ava's students. Curious, he opened it and read. The simple, affectionate words revealed not just the admiration of the children, but the powerful presence Ava had in their lives as a teacher. The letter spoke of how she used music to soothe their small hearts, how she taught with patience, and how she smiled even on the hardest days. The impact was immediate. In that moment, Ethan understood that there was far more to this woman than just a patient in a coma. There was a life story still very much alive beyond the hospital walls. There were affections that persisted despite her absence. He began collecting more letters. Quietly, he he asked Madison to bring more messages from the students, more records of Ava's life beyond that hospital bed. And with that, he assembled a small box, where he carefully organized each colorful piece of paper, every note with little drawings, each memory scribbled in fragile lines of crayon. He started reading some of the letters softly to himself, but with the feeling that maybe, in some way, Ava could hear. This new routine brought subtle but profound changes. Ethan, who had always kept himself detached from the personal lives of his patients, now dove deeply into Ava's story with sincere interest, not as part of a clinical study, but as someone who genuinely wanted to know her. He discovered, for example, that she organized small school performances with her students, blending storytelling with pieces of music to spark the children's imaginations. He learned that during the pandemic, even remotely, Ava had continued teaching through improvised online classes, encouraging her students to create melodies using cups, pans, and makeshift bells from home. These details came to him through short conversations with Madison, or from old notes found in her social file. And each discovery added new layers to the image of her that Ethan was forming. This was no longer just admiration. It was something quieter, deeper, an almost involuntary recognition of another person's beauty, of a kind of lightness that he himself had never managed to cultivate in his own rigid, reserved life. Motivated by this unexpected immersion, Ethan began studying more about classical music. He bought books with approachable explanations about the works of composers Ava loved. He read about Debussy's childhood, about the nostalgia woven into Satie's pieces, about the restrained romanticism of Chopin's compositions. He studied not with the rigor of someone trying to master a subject, but with the tenderness of someone wanting to get closer to another person respectfully. He jotted down curiosities, compared different versions of the same pieces, and watched rare performances recorded by unknown pianists. With this, he crafted little narrative moments that he would share with Ava during his nighttime visits, stories he told in a low voice, as if sharing secrets. He talked, for example, about how Satie composed gymnopédies inspired by ancient Greek sculptures, or how Chopin wrote music filled with longing for his homeland. These stories came to life in the silences of the room, among the steady beeps of monitors and the almost imperceptible hum of the machines. This continuous gesture of sharing and telling slowly transformed Ethan himself. Without realizing it, he began using musical terms in his everyday speech, even outside Ava's room. He started paying more attention to the sounds of the hospital, the pauses, the noises. He began recognizing rhythms in his colleagues' voices, harmony or dissonance in the environment. What began as an attempt to connect gradually became part of his identity, and Ava, still unconscious, was the silent center of all that change. Life around her remained in suspended rhythm, but not stagnant. There was movement, even without her waking up. There was transformation. Ethan continued his work with the same competence as always, but now there was more presence in every gesture, more attention to the details. The staff, though discreet, noticed that he spent more time in room 217 than was technically necessary, but no one questioned it. There was an implicit reverence in that relationship, something that went beyond the professional, but wasn't exactly personal either. It was a new territory, where care went beyond the physical and touched the emotional in a very real way. The night shift nurses started noticing that after Ethan had been in Ava's room, the space felt calmer. The monitors would sometimes show slight improvements, nothing major from a medical standpoint, but enough to prompt curious notes in the reports. There were nights when, after hearing the reading of a letter or an anecdote about Mozart, Ava's brainwaves showed subtle variations, as if responding to stimuli not fully understood. Ethan, however, avoided feeding premature expectations. He maintained his delicate approach. No fuss, no overly emotional interpretations. But inside, something stirred. He no longer saw Ava as a patient in a coma. To him, she was a whole presence, alive, vibrant, pulsing, and the silence of the room wasn't absence. It was fertile ground where new emotions grew, where silent bonds and unspoken promises quietly took root. Ethan even started adapting some of Ava's favorite pieces into simpler versions for her students. He created small videos with gentle visuals and simple subtitles, combining phrases from the letters with the melodies she loved most. He asked for help from a colleague who worked in pediatric rehab to develop a series of sensory materials inspired by the methods Ava had used with her students. Even without saying it aloud, he wanted her, when she woke up, to know that the world hadn't stopped, that her seeds continued to bloom, that even while asleep, she was still inspiring, that someone, him, had been so deeply touched that he could no longer ignore the path they had quietly walked together. And all of this happened in the in-between moments of exhausting shifts and empty dawns. It was there, in that space between what is seen and what is felt, that Ethan reinvented his way of caring, feeling, and existing. As Ethan continued his quiet routine of visiting room 217, something shifted subtly within that silent space. No matter how much the clinical protocols dictated that coma patients be treated consistently, what the monitors began to record in recent weeks defied the initial prognosis. The nighttime sessions of reading and music, always carried out with the same care and respect, began to coincide with physiological changes, first barely noticeable, then more consistent. The nursing staff, accustomed to the static patterns of patients in vegetative states, started noting more frequent variations in Ava's heart rate. They were minimal but real. The rhythm slowed in a harmonious way, gently fluctuating during softer pieces by Debussy or during the melodic passages of Chopin. At other times, the fingers on her left hand twitched involuntarily, as if some forgotten part of her body still responded to the memory of a piano no longer within reach. These records, which might previously have been dismissed as involuntary reflexes, began to draw more attention, mainly because they happened in sync with Ethan's presence. He, while remaining reserved, followed the clinical reports closely and quietly noticed these small responses with a mix of hope and reverence. He knew there was no concrete proof that his presence was the direct cause of the changes, but he also couldn't ignore that on days he couldn't visit her, the indicators stayed stable, without fluctuation. This was no longer just a coincidence. There was a shared rhythm between the two of them, a silent cadence growing stronger without the need for words. Ethan didn't look for explanations, nor did he want to create fanciful theories. It was enough for him to observe. He felt something moving, not in the realm of certainties, but in the realm of what is real, even when it cannot be touched. Ava remained unconscious, but her presence felt heavier, denser, as though she were slowly rising from a deep layer of sleep. At certain moments, while music filled the room, her eyes seemed to move beneath her closed eyelids. Other times, her hand rested more firmly on the sheet, as though trying to hold on to something. Ethan began lingering longer during his visits, respecting the limits imposed by the monitors, but savoring each instant as if it were unique. There was no rush, no anxiety. Everything was guided by a rare kind of patience, the kind that is born when hope no longer needs to prove itself. Instead of chasing results, he simply offered his presence. He brought new letters, read excerpts from books he found among her belongings, shared stories about lesser-known composers, and talked about old recordings he'd discovered on rare vinyl. He transformed the once cold and impersonal hospital room into an intimate space, full of meaning, a space that belonged only to him and Ava. These changes did not go unnoticed by some members of the medical team, although no one dared to intervene. It was as if everyone understood that there was something there that went beyond the boundaries of science. Madison, always discreet, observed from a distance and remained available whenever needed, delivering new notes, bringing mementos from the school children, updating Ethan on events happening outside the hospital. She could see that the neurologist, once so closed off and methodical, had transformed. There was more softness in his gestures, more silence in his responses, more time in his gaze. It was as if Ethan, in trying to reach Ava in her invisible world, had discovered within himself an unexplored territory. The small physiological reactions Ava displayed were no longer just clinical data. They became signs, bonds, silent correspondences between two worlds, one still asleep, the other learning how to feel. Over time, Ethan began to catalog these small responses with care, not for scientific purposes, but as someone who writes an intimate journal. He would note in his personal notebook the times when certain songs played and the reactions that followed. He wrote about the subtle movements of her fingers, the almost imperceptible smiles that sometimes appeared on Ava's sleeping face, the moments when her heartbeat stabilized. He compared all of this to the letters he read, trying to understand whether there was any connection between the children's words and the changes in her body. Without realizing it, he had created a kind of choreography between emotion and biology, a silent dance that defied the borders between science and affection. And the deeper he went into that bond, the more he felt that he could no longer pull away. What had once been an act of curiosity had become an essential part of his routine, and more than that, a part of his own transformation. On a particularly quiet morning, while playing a piece by Eric Satie, he noticed a slight movement at the corner of Ava's lips. It wasn't a clear smile, nor a common muscle contraction. It was something different, a tiny gesture, but one filled with meaning. Ethan, who had long since learned not to fool himself with premature hopes, felt something different this time. There was consistency in that movement, a trace of consciousness that defied randomness. He chose not to mention it to his colleagues. He kept it to himself, as someone who protects a secret too precious to be exposed. From that moment on, he began to observe every tiny detail even more carefully, and Ava, in silence, continued responding. Not with words, not with wide gestures, but with small signs that, to him, carried the weight of a reunion. Time, which once seemed frozen, began to move differently in that room. The days stretched into long hours of waiting, yet they also felt shorter in the face of these small discoveries. Ethan's presence became constant, even when he wasn't physically there. His attention lingered. His presence echoed in the music programmed to play at specific times, in the books left open on the bedside table, in the letters carefully placed beside her bed. The space gradually filled with meaning, with care, with memory. And Ava, still asleep, began to occupy an increasingly present place in Ethan's life. He no longer saw her as a mystery to be solved, but as a presence to be respected, listened to, and waited for. And he waited, with the kind of patience that only exists when love is already quietly taking root. As the long nights fell over Boston, when the hospital's silence contrasted with the rush of the day, Ethan began spending more time in the room where Ava lay in a coma, no longer just as a doctor, but as someone whose presence found a purpose there. Winter was already tracing its marks on the window panes, forming frosty patterns that resembled broken sheet music, and perhaps, because of that, the cardiologist started bringing a small speaker with him, playing recordings that Madison had gradually shared, revealing Ava's sensitive talent at the piano. It was a delicate way of extending her presence into that space, even though her body remained still beneath the soft covers, with wires still running through her thin arms. To the sound of every precisely played note, Ethan felt something fragile, almost imperceptible, shift inside him. This quiet routine had started as a gesture of curiosity and respect, but slowly turned into an intimate habit. He would arrive when the hallways were already silent, and the monitors emitted only the basic sounds of life being watched. He brought with him old books on music and medicine, alternating between technical readings and essays on the relationship between harmony and physiology. He never spoke to anyone at the hospital about these visits, or how much time he spent there. The world outside carried on, but inside that room, the minutes seemed to slow down, as if respecting the gentle tempo of the symphonies filling the air. While listening to the pieces Ava had recorded at home, he imagined the scene of her fingers gliding over the keys, her upright posture, her focused gaze, and without realizing it, he began developing a quiet affection for a woman he had yet to meet in a conscious state. It was a new feeling for Ethan, who had always kept strict control over his emotions. Coming from a family of traditional doctors, he had learned early on that emotions could be obstacles in his profession. Logic, reasoning, and efficiency had always ruled his days, and that was why his reputation among colleagues was that of a brilliant but impenetrable professional. But there was something about Ava's story that slipped beyond the grasp of reason. It was as if every melody she had recorded carried a trace of her essence, a reflection of the joy she passed on to her students, the grief she endured alone after losing her parents, the quiet strength that kept her alive even now. And Ethan, who for so long had listened only to the technical noises of medicine, began to realize that there was more to hear than just the beeping of a heart monitor. The recordings weren't from a studio, but they carried an intimacy that grand concerts could never reach. The sound of her breathing before each note, the faint creak of the wooden bench beneath her movements, the restrained warmth in every chord revealed a woman who used music as an extension of her own soul. Listening to her interpret Debussy with an almost fragile delicacy or dive into the emotional intensity of Chopin, Ethan felt that the room became less of an ICU bed and more of an invisible concert hall. At times, he allowed himself to close his eyes and just listen, letting himself be carried by something that hadn't touched him in a long time, the ability to feel without protecting himself. Ava, even unconscious, was guiding him through emotional landscapes he had never known, and for that reason, he didn't fight what was forming between them, even if it was something one-sided. Or at least, that's what he believed. As the days passed and the city faced the harshness of winter, with its biting winds and snow-covered dawns, that room in Massachusetts General Hospital maintained its own kind of warmth, not from the heating system, but from the bond Ethan silently nurtured. The doctors on the team noticed his constant attention to the case, though they didn't fully understand the real motivations. His presence at Ava's bedside seemed like an extension of his job, but no one suspected how often he returned, the books he left on the small table, or the playlists he carefully created, mixing classical pieces with her own recordings. Not even Madison, who trusted his professional posture, knew about the transformation happening behind the scenes, between the formal visits and the moments he stole to sit beside the young woman, as if his quiet vigil were necessary for something within her to keep holding on. And hold on, she did. Slowly, Ava's body responded in subtle but consistent ways. Her vital signs remained stable, and every so often, small involuntary contractions in her fingers or eyebrows seemed to indicate that the coma was no longer entirely impenetrable. Ethan, who was not a man prone to illusions, began to consider that there might be a connection between his presence and those tiny responses. He knew science would explain it as neurological reflexes or automated responses, but something deep inside told him that this silent bond echoed beyond that. The music, his presence, his soft voice, reading excerpts about art, or describing his discoveries in harmony studies, all of it seemed to penetrate some invisible crack within her. In the rare moments he managed to pause and reflect outside the hospital, back at home, he would mentally revisit the time spent by her side. He realized that he was skipping social gatherings, avoiding medical events, even turning down family invitations to maintain his routine centered around the hospital. And although he didn't admit it clearly, he knew that this behavior wasn't driven by professional duty. Something within him found rest in that silent dedication. For the first time, he felt free from the pressure to be flawless. Beside Ava, even without her responding, he could simply be a man learning how to listen. And that transformed him, even if no one saw it, even if no one knew. And so, night after night, he kept returning, carrying in one hand books he never would have read before, and in the other, the speaker that turned that room into an extension of her soul. While winter continued its course over Boston, freezing the city fountains and blanketing the old rooftops in white, something inside Ethan slowly thawed, a sensitivity he thought he had left in the past, but that Ava, unknowingly, was quietly rekindling. As the days went on, and winter settled more harshly over Boston, Ethan's routines in the hospital began to shift, no longer shaped by the demands of his shifts, but by the invisible subtleties that brought him closer and closer to Ava. What began as quiet visits, discreet recordings, and bedside readings soon started reflecting parts of himself that had long been buried beneath the weight of routine, professional demands, and the emotional walls he had built over the years. Ethan, who had always stood out for his serious demeanor, surgical precision, and absolute pragmatism, began to experience something that went beyond the doctor-patient relationship, but not in a romanticized, impulsive, or idealized way. It was a transformation born from within, as quiet as Ava's own presence, and it showed in details he used to overlook: the time he spent listening to patients, the way he slowed his own steps down the corridors, the way he looked at families when delivering delicate news. It wasn't something he had planned. No conscious decision had made him change. It was, above all, a reflection of what he was receiving without realizing it, the delicacy hidden in her piano notes, the courage of someone who had survived so much loss and still kept alive the ability to inspire, even unconscious. Ethan, who had functioned for so long as an efficient cog within the hospital system, began allowing himself small deviations. He started noticing when a nurse was exhausted, when a medical student's hands trembled from insecurity, when an elderly patient needed listening more than medication. And quietly, He began to step in during those moments, offering time, words, or simply presence. His colleagues started commenting that he seemed different, lighter, more open, but no one could pinpoint exactly what had changed. Only Madison, who watched everything with careful eyes, understood that this transformation originated in that room where Ava lay. Ethan's reconnection with forgotten parts of himself happened gradually. It started with music, which had once sounded to him merely like background noise, devoid of clinical meaning. As he studied the composers Ava loved, he began to understand the emotional language embedded in the compositions. He realized how certain chords could trigger memories, calm agitation, or provoke states of introspection. This new way of listening expanded his perception of his own limits. He, who had always navigated by metrics, reports, and exams, began to also value silence, the smallest gestures, the non-invasive touch. And this started resonating in his relationships outside the hospital as well. At home, he noticed the distance between him and his parents lessening when he spoke about Ava. He discovered it was possible to talk about emotions without seeming fragile. The coldness he had once used as armor gave way to a sensitivity that didn't weaken him. On the contrary, it strengthened the bonds he had once avoided building. Ava, even unconscious, became a mirror for the parts of himself he had erased over the course of his professional journey. He remembered when he was still a young student, full of enthusiasm, dreaming not just of awards or status, but of the chance to make a real difference in someone's life. Time, endless shifts, losses, and the demands of his career had hardened that initial desire, replacing it with practical goals and extreme self-control. But now, standing before her, those old dreams resurfaced. He asked himself, even if not in words, what had pulled him away from that more sensitive version of himself. And even without seeking a rational answer, he allowed himself to inhabit this new territory, more intuitive, more human. Each night, Ethan returned to Ava's room. He felt less like the doctor who was supposed to have all the answers, and more like someone willing to listen, even without receiving any response. It was a powerful paradox. The more she remained in silence, the more he was able to listen to himself. And that reflected in the clinical decisions he made, in the way he guided the residents, in the empathy he extended even to the most difficult patients. The Ethan now walking through the hospital was no longer the one who entered in silence and left absorbed in his own reports. He was a man who smiled more often, who held the hands of anxious patients during exams, who lingered a few extra minutes at bedsides, listening to stories he would have once considered irrelevant. Over time, even Ethan's own body reacted to the change. He slept better, despite the long shifts. He paid more attention to how he ate, moved with less tension in his shoulders. The aches that had once constantly appeared in his back and neck began to fade, as if the inner rigidity, now dissolving, had stopped demanding its physical toll. That transformation wasn't visible on graphs, wasn't part of any medical report, but it was happening, powerfully. And though he didn't share with anyone what he was going through, the look in his eyes when standing before Ava carried a serenity that depended on neither promises nor plans, only the acceptance of the present moment. Even though she didn't move, even though her eyes remained closed, Ava was, in some way, active in this process. Her story, her music, her presence, alive even in the absence of consciousness. All of it acted like a field of energy that surrounded him. Ethan began to care for her with a tenderness that went beyond traditional medicine. It was as if, by taking care of her, he was also taking care of himself. The touches that had once been mere procedures became gestures of respect. Clinical evaluations gained layers of emotional observation. It wasn't reckless involvement. It was a kind of surrender that finally united the scientist with the man, the specialist with the human being. In this way, Ethan stopped being just an efficient doctor. Slowly, he became a vital link in Ava's journey, and at the same time, she became the silent center of his. Among the cold hospital hallways, the delicate sheet music echoing from the little speaker, and the books left on the bedside table, something was formed, something no diagnosis could capture, but that everyone in some way began to notice. A change that couldn't be measured but could be felt. And this transformation, sparked by an unlikely encounter, now spread like a constant melody, shaping new ways of existing for both of them. As the months passed, the Boston hospital kept its steady rhythm of machines, protocols, and prolonged silences. The seasons changed outside. The intense cold gave way to the damp gray of spring, and then to the suffocating heat of early summer. Ethan continued his routine with discipline, even though his inner self was no longer the same. The transformation Ava had sparked in him had now settled, almost imperceptibly to others, but deeply rooted within him. Even without direct contact with her for weeks, even without returning as frequently to room 406, the connection they had built remained present in his gestures, decisions, and the way he existed in the world. He no longer needed to play the music every night, or reread the letters her students had sent to feel her presence. She had become part of him. It was as if that silent presence had awakened a strength that now didn't rely on external stimuli to exist. The transformation was no longer something he was doing. It was something he had become. Ava, meanwhile, remained still for long months, her body obeying its own rhythm, as if her time followed a different metric than the one imposed by the hospital calendar. Her heartbeat remained steady, her tests stable, and slowly the signs became clearer. Intensified involuntary movements, light contractions in her fingers, changes in how her eyes responded to light. The medical team followed the protocol without enthusiasm, cautious given her clinical history. Madison, with her determined patience, never stopped believing. She organized passive physical therapy sessions, ensured hydration was paired with sensory stimulation, and convinced her colleagues to maintain the routine of familiar sounds, even if, to many, it seemed pointless. Ethan, while maintaining professional distance, observed everything carefully. In silence, he followed the reports, reviewed the charts, participated in medical discussions with his usual rigor, but without speaking much. The emotional involvement that had once brought him closer to Ava now demanded restraint. And then, on a stifling July afternoon, just as the hospital began to empty with the change of shifts, something unexpected broke the pattern that had held for so long. Ava opened her eyes, not abruptly, like in idealized scenes, but slowly, like someone returning from a deep dive and needing time to understand where they were. Her eyes moved sluggishly, capturing shapes and shadows without immediate comprehension. Her body was still fragile, her face pale, her muscles weak, but there was something there that hadn't been seen since the day of the accident: consciousness. The news spread through the hallways with restrained speed, as if even the doctors hesitated to believe what the monitors confirmed. She was awake, still confused, still surrounded by fog, but alive. Ethan heard the news while reviewing charts in his office. Hearing her name mentioned between two nurses in conversation made his heart race, but he didn't show it. He stood up calmly, crossed the hallway, and positioned himself behind the glass that separated the observation post from the room. There she was, her eyes half open, breathing without assistance, trying to decipher the faces around her. In the hours that followed, protocol was resumed with precision. Neurological evaluations, imaging exams, clinical stabilization, and then referral for occupational therapy and intensive rehabilitation. Ethan didn't intervene. He knew that now his role needed to remain technical. Any misstep could jeopardize the structure he himself had built to preserve his medical ethics. Still, inside, something stirred powerfully. Seeing Ava awake, even without recognizing him immediately, triggered a wave of emotions he couldn't contain. For the first time in years, he needed to step away for a few minutes and retreat to an empty room just to breathe. And there, with his fists resting on the cold steel countertop, he allowed himself to feel, without guilt, without restraint, the quiet joy, the surprised relief, the silent gratitude. In the days that followed, Ava progressed slowly. Her memory was still confused, her movements uncertain, but her consciousness grew stronger with each new morning. The entire team became involved in her rehabilitation, adjusting routines, suggesting exercises, reintroducing sounds, images, and words. In one of her first occupational therapy sessions, when she still struggled to keep her eyes focused for long, she reacted upon hearing a piano recording. The familiar sound triggered a primal emotion in her, and tears slid down her cheeks. She didn't yet understand where she knew that melody from, but she felt, with a certainty that didn't require logic, that it was part of her story. The therapist noticed the impact and began playing the same track in future sessions, without revealing its origin. And little by little, like pieces of a puzzle rebuilt from intuition, Ava began assembling fragments of memory. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed nearby but at a distance. He monitored reports, read the rehabilitation records, reviewed the neurologist's updates, but didn't interact with her directly. The hospital was big enough to allow for this strategic distance, yet small enough that he could follow every step without being in the same space. Even when he knew she was in a certain wing, he organized his schedule to avoid running into her. It wasn't fear, it was respect. He understood that, in that moment, any gesture made out of place could cause confusion or unnecessary expectation. There was also a trace of self-preservation, a need to protect what he had lived in the previous months, without turning it into something he couldn't sustain. It was during an especially quiet morning, in the middle of an auditory stimulus recognition session, that Ava responded more clearly. Upon hearing a specific sequence, one of the songs Madison had recorded for Ethan to play during those autumn nights, her body trembled slightly. Her eyes locked onto the source of the sound with more focus than before, and her breathing quickened. A few seconds later, with visible effort, she uttered a short sentence, her voice still weak but filled with intention. She commented that the music was familiar, that someone used to play it for her. The therapists exchanged glances, unsure how much they could or should reveal. And Ava, eyes half closed and wearing an expression of exhaustion, murmured that someone had also read to her. She couldn't remember the face or the name, only the sensation, comforting, present, constant. Ethan learned about the episode from the team's report. He read the document with steady hands, but felt the impact of the words as if he'd heard them himself. For the first time, there was a chance that Ava remembered, even if vaguely, the moments they had shared. And that changed everything. He had to restrain himself from shifting his stance. He knew that, above all, she needed stability, safe guidance, and professional support. The urge to be near her was intense, but his sense of responsibility was stronger. Deep down, he knew their true reunion couldn't be born from anxiety or longing. It would have to happen in the right time, and he was willing to wait. After weeks of intense rehabilitation, during which Ava's body responded with surprising strength to both physical and mental stimuli, the doctors authorized her discharge. It didn't come with fanfare or visible celebrations, but with a quiet serenity that reflected both relief and a new responsibility. Madison, always by her friend's side, took charge of this transition with the care of someone who understood the delicacy of reinserting oneself into a world that had kept moving while Ava was absent. The streets of Boston remained busy. Pedestrians hurried along. The noise of traffic carried on unchanged. But inside her, everything felt different, as if every sound, every light, every touch now carried an extra layer of meaning. Returning to the music school, Ava felt the symbolic weight of the moment, not just because it was a return to the physical space she knew, but because part of her identity lived there. The rooms were still in the same place, the instruments perfectly tuned, the hallways lined with old posters and memories of past events. But she was no longer the same woman who had walked those hallways months before. There was a serenity in her now that didn't exist before the accident, a sharper awareness of life's fragility, and the strength born precisely from that fragility. With Madison's attentive support, Ava organized her routine in a way that allowed her to gradually rebuild her independence, without forcing her body or mind into a pace it couldn't yet sustain. She dedicated her mornings to light physical exercise, neighborhood walks, in-home physical therapy, and moments reserved for music, not just as a student or teacher, but as a form of inner listening. Her afternoons, on the other hand, were filled with reading. Unlike before, when her books mostly revolved around sheet music, composer biographies, or teaching methodologies, her attention now turned to a new universe: neuroscience. Not by chance, she dove deeply into studies about neuroplasticity. She wanted to understand how the human brain could rebuild itself after trauma, how sensory experiences left such profound marks, how music, touch, and listening contributed to the recovery of consciousness. Inspired by her own journey, Ava began visiting the public library near the school regularly. There, she found silence, focus, and access to specialized works that fueled her curiosity even more. Often, she lost track of time reading about synaptic connections, cortical maps, and clinical cases that, in a way, mirrored what she herself had experienced. It was on one of those stifling late summer afternoons that, as she turned down one of the library's main aisles, Ava crossed paths with a familiar figure that made her pause for a brief moment. Ethan was there, leaning against the medical section shelves, examining an old volume with the same focused concentration he used to show when reviewing medical charts. He was dressed simply, without the lab coat that identified him at the hospital, but carried an unmistakable composure. The encounter was unexpected, yet somehow it felt natural. Both maintained the kind of quiet discretion that comes from understanding the importance of time and space for something new to emerge with stability. Without the need for words, just with a slight nod, they acknowledged each other's presence. Ava, with a subtle smile, stepped closer and noticed that the book in his hands dealt with neurological recovery processes in trauma patients. There was a coincidence there that didn't need to be spoken. Both knew what that book represented. It wasn't just a technical study. It was, in some way, an attempt to understand the experience that silently connected them. He, in turn, noticed that she was holding 2 volumes about memory and sensory perception, as if the paths that once ran separately now intersected by natural affinity. The exchange that began there didn't happen abruptly, nor with any attempt to rush things. After a few minutes quietly sharing that space, almost symbolically, they decided to head to the small cafe next to the library. The discreet setting, with its soft lighting and the constant aroma of freshly brewed coffee, offered the perfect backdrop for a reunion that, though casual, carried the weight of everything left unsaid. They sat at one of the tables in the back, surrounded by silence, broken only by the gentle clinking of cups being set on saucers. Time didn't seem to be in a hurry. The conversation flowed in a light tone, moving between literary references, recent discoveries, and everyday observations. Neither felt the need to mention the hospital, the accident, or the long recovery. All of that was present, but dissolved in their gestures, in their glances, in the small silences filled with meaning. When they said goodbye that evening, they did so naturally. There were no promises, only a quiet sense of continuity. In the days that followed, their exchange took on another form: borrowed books, notes left between pages, emails with reading suggestions, quiet messages exchanged at the end of the day. It wasn't the kind of classic romance built on confessions or declarations. It was something more intimate, more organic, growing at the exact pace of the delicacy they had both learned to nurture. For Ava, that rhythm made perfect sense. After everything she had been through, every step toward someone else needed to be firm, but also gentle. For Ethan, there was a serene comfort in that kind of closeness, one without demands, without urgency. For years, he had grown used to control, to emotional distance, to the predictability that medicine required. But with Ava, he had learned there was strength in vulnerability, beauty in uncertainty, and truth in everything that doesn't need to be named. This new bond, built far from the hospital hallways and free from the limitations of medical ethics, allowed both of them to rediscover themselves, not as patient and doctor, nor as survivor and caregiver, but as 2 people who had been marked by a profound experience and who now chose to come closer based on what they had learned through pain. The messages became more frequent, the meetings more spontaneous. Still, nothing was rushed. Each gesture, each choice, carried the care of those who respect their own time and the others. And so, between exchanged books, shared coffees, and comfortable silences, a new story began to take shape. Not a story interrupted by tragedy, but a brand new narrative, born from survival, quiet affection, and mutual admiration. As the months went by, the routine Ava had built after her recovery gained more stable contours, though delicately sensitive to the passage of time. Mornings were once again filled with music, now in a renovated room where her youngest students rehearsed with growing enthusiasm under her precise and patient guidance. Her personal experience of overcoming trauma not only brought her a new perspective on her own body and mind, but also deeply affected the way she related to others. In every gesture, there was more attentive listening, a longer gaze, a softness that extended to the advice she gave the young students who saw her as a role model. Ava no longer worried about external goals, awards, relentless schedules, or validation. She taught with presence, allowing music to become a bridge and a shelter for each child growing under her guidance. The echoes of the hospital, of pain, of vulnerability, still lived inside her, but now as memories that added depth to her actions, not as a burden. At the same time, her exchanges with Ethan subtly intensified. Though they remained discreet, each new interaction carried the feeling of a bond growing stronger from within, far from labels or pressure. The affection between them bloomed through everyday gestures. A book left at the school's front desk with an almost invisible dedication, a song suggested by email after an exhausting day, an unexpected walk after a casual encounter. They both understood the nature of what they were building. Slow, concrete, made of shared silences and genuine admiration. It was during the organization of her student semester recital that Ava realized the magnitude her journey had reached. Not because the event was grand or luxurious, but because every note played by those young musicians indirectly reflected the hope she had cultivated since her hospital bed. The night of the recital arrived wrapped in a thin layer of snow covering the rooftops and sidewalks of the city. Boston seemed suspended in time, silent and white like a freshly printed sheet of music. The school prepared a modest room for the event, with carefully arranged chairs, finely tuned instruments, and soft lighting. The students' parents, friends, neighbors, and colleagues filled the seats, eager to witness the result of months of dedication. Ava, although accustomed to the environment, felt a distinct emotion running through her skin that night. Not from nervousness, but from an intuition she couldn't quite name. The recital flowed gracefully. Each student, upon stepping onto the stage, expressed something unique. Some performances were more technical, others more intuitive, but all carried the magic of those discovering their own voice through keys and strings. It was during the final performance of the program that Ava noticed, among the faces in the audience, someone she hadn't expected to find there. Ethan, seated discreetly in one of the center rows, dressed with his usual sobriety, but his eyes carried something different. It wasn't surprise or mere admiration. It was a quiet recognition. His gaze remained steady throughout the entire piece, as if the notes themselves traced direct bridges to their shared memories. Ava, in a spontaneous gesture, finished guiding the student and, instead of leaving the stage, walked toward the microphone with the calm of someone who no longer needed to hide from her own emotions. She didn't speak a word. She simply looked at Ethan, who understood the invitation without it needing to be said out loud. Slowly, he stood and made his way to the stage. The audience followed the gesture with curiosity but didn't interfere. It was as if everyone there instinctively understood that they were about to witness something more intimate than just a simple performance. Sitting next to her, Ethan positioned himself at the piano with a certain hesitation, but also with resolve. For weeks, in secret, he had been practicing a short piece, simple in technique, but rich in meaning. Not because he wanted to impress her, but because he wanted to be present in a new way, vulnerable, open. The melody that filled the next few minutes of that room wasn't grand, nor was it technically challenging, but it struck directly at a place of mutual recognition. Ava adjusted the tempo gently, and together, they started the first chords. The harmony between them didn't rely on musical perfection, but on the invisible connection that had bound them from the beginning. His hands, once so accustomed to the rigidity of scalpels and reports, now glided humbly over the keys. There was no rush, no doubt, only the surrender of two worlds that touched without spectacle, without promises. During the performance, they exchanged quiet glances. Neither smiled openly, but in both their eyes lived a profound emotion, made of everything they had endured, everything they had discovered, everything they had built in silence. At the end of the piece, the room remained silent for a few seconds, not from a lack of applause, but out of respect for the delicacy of the moment. And when the applause finally came, it sounded like a soft breeze, like the acknowledgement of something rare, almost sacred. After the performance, without ceremony or speeches, Ethan extended his hand to Ava. She, with serenity, accepted. There were no explanations, no confessions, no need to define what was being born there. Just the gesture, simple, direct, full of meaning. As they left the venue, they crossed the snow-covered streets, walking side by side like two travelers who, after a long journey, found each other again at a safe shelter. The city, silent beneath the slowly falling snowflakes, bore witness to that farewell to the past and the welcoming of the present. Neither of them spoke, but the absence of words didn't mean an absence of communication. On the contrary, it was in the quiet of their shared steps that the confirmation lived, that something true had bloomed. When they reached the corner of the Maple and Mist Cafe, they found the place nearly empty, warmed by amber lighting and the constant aroma of cinnamon and coffee. They walked in together, sat at one of the tables by the window, and finally, without rush, shared the first cup of coffee of a life that now began again, not as an escape, nor as a miraculous cure, but as a possible continuation, as two souls who allowed themselves to feel, to transform, and finally, to walk together.